fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Joining us now are Dr. Michael Stone and Dr. Gary Brucato. Thank you for being here, guys.
Welcome, sir. Thank you. It's our pleasure.
How did you guys get interested in writing these types of books? Like your book is The New Evil, and your last book was called Anatomy of Evil. So what brought you together and got you into this subject?
Well, Michael, why don't you handle that one? Well, I can start with the first part, because, in other words, the Anatomy of Evil was done some years ago, 10 years ago, and then Gary and I have only been working together for the past 2 years. But originally it got started even earlier. The inspiration, if you want to call it that, back in '87 when I went out to California to help as an expert witness on behalf of Joe McGinnis, the author who had written a book, Fatal Vision, about the Green Beret officer Jeffrey McDonald, who had come back to the States and was living with his wife and children in North Carolina. He ended up killing his wife and his two daughters when she had spotted. She came back unexpectedly early, let's say from a psychology class out there one evening, and she saw him doing something inappropriately sexual with the older daughter. And I imagine she upbraided him for that. And at that point, he became infuriated and stabbed to death his pregnant wife and the two children. And then pretended that it was not really done by him, but by some people that invaded the house. And at first, he was let go as though the army believed him, and so that he was like an innocent man. And Joe McGinnis and he worked together on a book about the incident and so on. They became buddies. But then, in the course of time, not too much time either, the stepfather of the dead, of the murdered wife, found other evidence, suitcases left in certain places, neighbors' comments from the air conditioning vent where they overheard stuff that made it very clear that Jeffrey McDonald was guilty after all. So at that point, that really severed the friendship between McGinnis and McDonald, and McGinnis had to write a quite different book. And I was then, but the interesting thing was that McDonald, a psychopath that he was angry at McGinnis, like, where's my royalty money? We were supposed to share royalty money for the book, which became a popular book, and even so, the law says that if you kill somebody and then someone writes a book about it, or you write a book about it, you don't get royalty money. And I went out to California, and along with another forensic psychiatrist, and tried to enlighten the jury about what kind of a guy this was and where this particular murder fell in the grand scheme of other terrible acts. For example, it was worse than a crime of passion, but it was not as bad as a man who tortured and before he killed, and such as Ian Brady in England, who with his girlfriend Myra Hindley would lure and capture children in the isolated area in the British Moors, and then Ian Brady would strangle the children, record the screams on a tape recorder, and use that, believe it or not, as a a sexual measure, to sort of heighten the sexual pleasure between him and Myra. It's totally sick. So that was the worst thing I knew at the time. But it was the beginning of the creating of the scale, and I figured that Jeffrey MacDonald was in the middle somewhere, because it was a lot worse than a crime of passion, where you, let's say, catch your wife or lover or whatever, being unfaithful, sleeping with somebody else, and then you kill those people or one of them. But it was not as bad as Ian Brady. And then at that point, I began reading true crime books, because a whole book gives a lot of information about the early years, often of the killer, and therefore, especially as a psychoanalyst, I get interested in what might it be the early background of such men and what motivates them to do these terrible things. Whereas if you just read a little magazine article or newspaper article, it doesn't tell you all of those facts about the early background of the person. So I now have a rather large library of over 800 true crime books of that sort, and which include over almost 200 serial killers and many other rapists and mass murderers and various other kinds of people who do evil acts. And so then as I began to read more and more of these books, obviously there were in-between places that were a little bit worse than the crime of passion, but not quite as bad as what Jeffrey MacDonald had done. So eventually I ended up with 22 different gradations on the scale. I mean, it was an arbitrary number. One could imagine a scale that had fewer numbers, or maybe one with more, but I settled on 22 being the worst, where there's not only murder, but extreme torture before the murder, as about the worst thing that one can do in the way of evil. So that was the book that came from that, about 2009, I think, 10 years ago. And then in the last couple of years, Dr. Brucato and I have gotten together and expanded on this theme, and because we've noted that a lot of very terrible crimes that occur recently are unique in the sense that they hardly ever occurred earlier than the 1960s. So there's something that changed in the last 50 years in the way of an awfulness of what one person may do to another. Horrid things in peacetime, mind you, that hardly ever happened before. Of course, in wartime, the bets are off. Unspeakable things have happened between one bunch of people and another bunch of people going back to the beginning of time. But our focus is on the terrible things that are so bad as to elicit the name, the word of evil. Things that strike people as evil, they'll gasp and they'll wince and they'll say, "Oh my God, that was evil," when they hear about some very, very terrible, especially torturous act that one person did to another.
In my own background, I had sort of the dual focus in my career, across my clinical work, where I had forensic training and experience, working in hospitals with people that were incarcerated, forensic patients, doing volunteer work that was prison work. I worked in a Rikers Island unit. There was a psychiatric unit at Elmhurst Hospital. Did a lot of training and had to do evaluations like the Hare psychopathy checklist and competency exams and so forth, reports to the family courts and things like that. And at the same time, I was really working in the area of early psychosis, what's called attenuated psychosis, sort of the phase of softer psychotic symptoms before someone has a psychotic break, and maybe never will. It's the latter work, and increasingly the former work now, that I do at Columbia Medical Center at a place called COPE, Center of Prevention and Evaluation, which is for young people that are at risk of psychosis and potentially violence. And what happened is that along the way, I became very interested in what it is that wasn't mental illness, what wasn't psychosis or severe depression or mania, so forth, driving crime. And of course, the more you look into this stuff, the more you realize that it's a lot more complicated. There are people with particular personality configuration, particularly psychopathy, sadism, and so forth, that could really drive serious crime. So I got it in my mind that I wanted to write a book to help people make these distinctions, and I was interested myself. And I wound up acquiring several large caches of artwork and letters by infamous, serial killers and so forth from a few different parties, and in analyzing them, just found myself sort of mesmerized in how informative they were and revealing they were. And I brought them to a colleague, I spoke about them to a colleague here, a psychoanalyst named Clarice Kestenbaum, who then said, "Oh, you've got to get together with Michael Stone." And this, of course, a name very familiar to me because Michael's work had been, very important to me in my private studies and in my clinical work. It's easy to underestimate Michael's influence on the world of personality disorders and in the history of personality disorders and how they're treated and understood. And certainly knew his scale quite well from the TV show Most Evil that he had on Investigation Discovery, and from his book Anatomy of Evil. And of course, you can imagine the honor that I would be the person to write the follow-up to Anatomy of Evil with him. And over the past couple of years, we have really gotten into this stuff, and I think really added a little bit to the scale to flesh it out, so that now can accommodate crimes that people were a little confused about where they went in the scale. And I think what you're left with is a scale that really is not particularly arbitrary, but in fact establishes categories that I think very cleverly manage to, on the one hand, demonstrate the full spectrum of pathological behavior, in terms of personality organization, from narcissism through psychopathy all the way to sadism, but at the same time allows for research and study. And there are several groups that have already told me that, they're doing research where they're trying to see if these categories, hold weight or have predictive value, or help people, better understand the motivations of certain killers or rapists or so forth. So, we're very proud of the work, and it culminated in this book, The New Evil.
Dr. Bracuto, this is Mike Hawley. I research the Whitechapel murders of Jack the Ripper, but the question I have is, I can see this scale being they're wanting to be used in court. Do you see that happening? As finding out how evil this person is. So what do they get? What kind of crime should we? What should we give them?
Well, okay. So first of all, I think there's a couple of sort of ground rules to sort of lay out. Well, first and foremost, I think it's very critical for the listeners to understand. I think Michael would really echo this: is that when we use the word evil, we are not talking about it in a kind of metaphysical or a supernatural sort of way. What we're referring to is evil as a psychological, emotional reaction that people have to a crime, regardless of where they're living on Earth or when they're living. They will have an emotional reaction, which is sort of horror, shock, bewilderment to a extreme premeditated act. Where we all sort of understand that reaction, and it sends us groping for words, like evil, and that's sort of what we're interested in is, that psychological reaction. Wouldn't you say, Michael? It's really a reaction word more than we're talking about something, supernatural. And once you understand that, then the idea of the scale is that it's really about acts that evoke that reaction more than others. That's really the idea. So when we say it could be used in court, where I think it's useful, is the way Michael was talking about it, where he originally envisioned it, that its purpose is to help people understand that not all acts, even if they fall under the same heading, like murder, are equally terrible, because some of them, for some reason, are more shocking to us than others. Why is that? Because there's something else going on, like the added touch of sadistic cruelty or premeditation or so forth. So a simple example of this I'll just give you two very quick examples of cases that both involve the same motivation. So these are cases that were widely reported in the media, and you'll see the trouble if you don't think about it the way we do, the way the law doesn't know how to make a distinction. So, for example, there was a man in Maine. His name was Samuel Collins, and supposedly very nice man, so forth, family father, and he was married to a woman that he was very crazy about, absolutely adored her. They had a healthy marriage as far as he knew. Everything was. So one day he decided to surprise her at the supermarket where she worked, and when he walked in, he found her kissing a coworker. Became extremely enraged, filled with jealousy, and when she returned home, he abruptly stabbed her to death, tried to kill himself, by knife. He survived. As I understand it, had subsequent remorse, so forth. It was totally out of character for him. It was essentially a crime of passion, of jealousy. Okay. Then you compare that with the infamous case that's called the parachute murder case, which was in Belgium, as I recall. It's a woman named Els Klootermans, and she and another woman developed a kind of a love triangle where they had an agreement, basically, where they were courting the same man, having relations with the same man, sort of on a schedule. I'll see him on Monday, you see him on Tuesday, such and such. What happened is, on one particular night, they were all under the same roof. They were preparing that, in about a week or so, they were going to go on a skydiving trip together. They were all skydivers. That's how they met, I believe. And while Els Klooterman was in the living room, I think the other woman and this guy were in the other room, and I think she overheard them making love or something like that. She became filled with jealousy and reportedly severed the release cord on the parachute that the other woman would be using. And a week later, when they went skydiving, she stuck her head out and sort of calmly watched as the other woman jumped out, couldn't release her parachute, and tumbled 2 miles to her death. And so you see that in both cases, we're talking about jealousy as the motivation, but what the law is sort of not really grasping when they think about the idea of crime of jealousy is that these are two very different types of people, where in one case you had premeditation and cruelty, where you thought about it for a week and then did the act and did something that was so extreme and over the top it wasn't necessary. Right? One could shoot someone quickly and painlessly as opposed to enjoying watching them fumble to their death for 2 miles. So I think where it comes in handy, I think that was precisely Michael's original intention, was to find a way to make people understand the depth of depravity that could be really behind a certain criminal act. Isn't that correct, Michael?
Yes, there's another element to this also, and that is that the people at the far end of the scale embody generally the concept of psychopathy as delineated by Robert Hare in Vancouver. And the real point, despite Ken Keel's somewhat, I think, over-optimistic impressions about what one can do therapeutically for a psychopath, which I think is very little, the point is that the psychopaths are, for all intents and purposes, untreatable, and therefore, if there would be a utility in the prison in the court situation, right? To say that this person, besides having murdered so and so or whatever, has the distinct features in the marked degree of psychopathic personality. Therefore, the idea of giving him 10 years with free off for good behavior is not a wise move. Because he is highly likely to reoffend if he ever were released, and do similar vicious things to other people. And I know the lawyer, of course, the defense attorneys are very much against that idea because they're busy trying to get the person either off altogether or with the least possible punishment. And the prosecution, of course, is on the side of I think the average guy. Mm-hmm. An average woman who wants the really terrible and least trustworthy people to have the most extended jail sentences or whatever, so that they do not reoffend and commit other heinous crimes. So that, but judges are a little bit uncomfortable, I think, honoring that that psychopaths should be dealt with in a harsher way, in a more serious way than people who do not embody the psychopathic traits. But it's a big issue for law. But I of course, and I think Dr. Brucato and I are on the side of wanting the concept to be more widely used, so that the most dangerous people get the longest sentences.
Right. I could see it being put into practice here in Canada, especially in our regard to our dangerous offender designation. Typically, if an offender is determined to be a dangerous offender, they are in jail for an indeterminate amount of time. It's likely that they won't ever get out. People like Clifford Olson and Paul Bernard,
like Chris Olson, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I mean, Olson,
or Terry Driver, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, Terry Driver, my co-host on Dark Poutine, actually grew up with his brother and watched movies with Terry Driver as a kid, and interestingly got some really good insight into that family. And there was apparently a room full of Nazi paraphernalia in that house.
Interesting. It's interesting because you're sort of subtly raising a point there, which is, where are these kind of people bred? I mean, is it about hereditary factors, or are there these kind of environmental factors that can influence this kind of behavior? What kind of combination do you need? And we're always fascinated, because Michael and I have found cases where people have what seems to be a purely hereditary sort of psychopathy, what you call primary psychopathy. But then, there's a conspicuous amount of negative, adverse childhood experiences in a lot of these people. This is what we call secondary psychopathy. But it does seem to involve a mixture. In fact, Michael and I were just talking about this, about how, it's interesting to think about if someone who has the hereditary features of a psychopath, a kind of a sensation-seeking, bored, kind of unafraid, remorseless kind of person, happens to have a good upbringing, the kind of parents that, teach them right from wrong and are always there for them and so forth, they might wind up in a pro-social kind of career. This might be the kind of person who fearlessly runs into a fire or rescues people or breaks up fights, because they're bent, twisted in the direction of liking other people. Whereas this, the bad abuse or so forth, alcoholic parents, so forth, whatever, that a lot of these people have, might be what pushes them in the other direction. The trouble with that is, it's twofold. One is, you've got plenty of people who grow up in adverse environments that don't become psychopaths, right? And then you've got, you've got to try to explain why it is that some people seem to just have the genetics. Michael, wouldn't you say, for example, Ted Bundy is an example of somebody that simply had no environmental explanation for his behavior, correct?
Yeah, that's the example I use. I have about half a dozen. I was just looking at my Excel sheet in front of me here on the computer of serial killers. But Ted was the one that had the violent grandfather, who may have actually been his real father through incest by the mother. And he then, the mother fled from him with her little baby Ted when he was about 2, out west in Seattle. And she married Bundy, working class guy, who was a nice person, never laid a hand, let alone spanked Ted. He was not neglected, Ted. He was brought up well. He was a bright fellow. He was, after all, spent a year in law school. However, he appeared to have the genetic predisposition to that kind of very low empathy, low capacity for compassion, and that is characterized as the psychopath. So he already killed somebody when he was a teenager. And then when he became enamored of a particular woman from a higher social class than his, she eventually rejected him. Perhaps she sniffed other things about him that were unsavory, besides simply the fact that he wasn't, from as moneyed a background as hers. And at that point, he began killing women that were lookalikes of the rejecting fiancé. And he killed probably 2.5 dozen or more women who looked very much like that woman that had dared to refuse his advances.
Do you folks feel like complicated family relationships like that, like adoption and those kind of things, often play a role in this sort of development, especially in regard to becoming misogynistic or like really hating women?
Well, let's put it this way: the among serial killers, just to focus on that one group, the number who come from who are adoptees basically is around 14 to 16%. That is 6 or 7 times or more greater than the number of people in the United States who are adoptees, which is about 2%. So there's two factors there. One, that sometimes there's an awful clash between the adopting parents and the child, or especially if the parents also have natural children and maybe they have a somewhat depreciatory attitude towards the adopted child. So there could be environmental factors that are disadvantageous to the development of the adopted kid that make him angry and feel hurt and unloved, etc. But the other factor, the genetic factor, is that especially in the last 2 generations, when we have the pill and abortion and so on, there are fewer kids, from good families, as it were, who where there's a pregnancy. It can be like a high school girl from a good family that gets in the family way and she might have an abortion. Or she's used the pill from an early age and she never gets pregnant in the first place. So therefore, the adoption pool is already different from what it was when I was growing up many years ago. And particularly if they adopt from Eastern Europe and Bulgaria, Romania, where the children often come from very, very poor alcohol abusing and drug abusing people, a woman is shacking up with a prostitute, getting a kid up for, in the orphanage, who stays there for 2.5 years and ends up with brain damage because of the poor care in the orphanage. Those persons are more apt to develop brain damage and psychopathic and other serious personality disturbances that make them more prone to commit crime.
Yeah. The reason I ask was just because I'm an adopted person myself, and so I have been through some psychological issues when I was younger around that kind of thing. So I've always kind of been watching myself for, am I one of those people? And as far as I can gather, because I haven't killed anybody, I don't think I am.
Well, I have a question about that also is both either if it's environmental or if it was genetic, the cognitive neuroscientists talk about that cognitive pathway for the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and that insula where that the lack of remorse comes from. And then that pathway, you can see it getting affected both environmentally or maybe that particular family, the genetics, the insula pathway just isn't there as much.
Yes, the Nobel Prize winning person at Columbia, Eric Kandel, just came out with a book a week or so ago that I've just been almost finished reading, where he talks about the disordered mind. I think that's the title of the book, actually. And he has a chapter on psychopathy and other serious personality disturbances, and he shows the brain pathways, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the nucleus accumbens, and then the frontal lobes, all of the areas that are different in the insula, as you mentioned, where if you're lacking too many neurons in that area, you have a hard time developing empathy for others and so on, that predispose to the development of the psychopathic personality, and that, of course, is a forerunner of many awful, behaviors. Because at the best, you might have a psychopath who's just a wheeler dealer on Wall Street, who cheats and gets rich, by cheating others, but doesn't ever hurt anyone physically, all the way to the kinds of psychopaths that Dr. Brucato and I are interested in, who commit not only murders, but oftentimes ones of unspeakable awfulness and torture, where the word evil leaps out of the mouth of anyone who hears about it.
Likening, would certainly be good examples of 22, and so would, of course, David Parker Ray, who Michael and I have really placed at the very pinnacle of the scale. He's so awful that he almost sort of tops the other Category 22s, Michael, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I've often thought that maybe we need a 23 for him. Because of the torture, you can't even talk about it, in public or on television. Because you can't show the pictures that I have, that the police officers in New Mexico gave me when I interviewed his accomplice Cindy Hendy for the Discovery Channel program, because they're just too disturbing, and not something to be shown in the newspaper or in the public.
I'm not sure if the listenership how familiar they would be with the case of David Parker, but perhaps we could briefly describe it. Would that be helpful?
I would like that.
Yeah, please do.
Well, David Parker Ray was it's quite a character. He was a kind of a charming, in some ways, mechanically minded, mechanically gifted, I would say, man, who in his youth was abused and sent away to live with grandparents that were also abusive. He had an alcoholic father who the only bonding he really ever had with the father was the father showing him pornographic magazines while intoxicated. That I always thought was psychologically significant, because it seems to represent the moment at which the idea of bonding with another person over pornography or something like that, was first potentially formed. But all throughout his life, he did form these perverse alliances with people, whether it was girlfriends, ultimately Cindy Hendy, one of his girlfriends, who was part of the torturing of people. He was even involving dogs, German shepherds, in the torture of girls, so that he loved very much. So he had this sort of fragmentation to his personality, where there were certain people that he was able to let into the secret world. And what happened is that while he was working as a park ranger out in New Mexico, he was gathering junk, objects and so forth, and little, did anybody know that he was bringing all of this stuff home and transforming it into devices that could be used for the most exquisite types of torture. What happened is he spent over $100,000 creating a place that he called the Toy Box, which was a kind of a soundproof trailer out in the desert. And what he would do is he would use Cindy Hendy, use whatever woman was in his life at the time, but Cindy Hendy, ultimately his daughter even, to go out and sort of either drug drinks or lure women. They would, he would sometimes pose the police officer. When the woman got in the car, Cindy Hendy would come out of the bathroom, in the trailer, in a trailer. She would come out of the bathroom, attack the woman. And what they would do is they would put a box over the head of the woman, a homemade contraption that was designed to completely disorient the woman. So she's bound and now has this kind of box on her head, and often they would even put duct tape all over the head, covering the eyes and so forth, and then the box on top. And what would happen is that the poor woman, the poor victim, would wake up, often hoisted by chains, in the trailer, in the toy box, and Ray would just sort of hit play on a tape recorder where he had a pre-recorded message that worked out to anywhere from 10 to 17 pages if you type it out, depending on where you type it out, where in this terrible kind of monotonous voice, sounds like a form letter, he just breaks down every methodical kind of horrendous sexual, psychological torture, physical torture that these women were going to be subjected to, and they would be. And after several days, he would then essentially drug them or engage in what he thought was sort of brainwashing, and then just sort of dump the person on the street or probably kill them. He said in his journals that he killed, sound like up to 70 women, if I remember, across his life, but he was ultimately never convicted of murder because he died during the process or got away with everything. But he did write extensive journals describing murder and the ranking of women he had sexually assaulted, all the way back to age 13. If I remember, Michael's first victim was when he was 13. He tied a woman to a tree and tortured her to death. But he was, it was just that the tortures that he subjected the women to were so incredibly protracted we're talking, I can't even describe them on in public, but it's beyond anything that I think your imagination as a healthy person could cook up.
And one of the victims, actually, I recall from your book, you mentioned that she even doubted that had happened to her, that she had been brainwashed and drugged so well that she was not even sure that it wasn't a nightmare.
That's right. It was coming back to her only in dreams. And then ultimately when the police were looking for people to come forward, it all came back to her very quickly. But Ray was very adept at things like that. He had a large library of books on medical care and female anatomy and things like Satanism, all kinds of things like that. And just to give you an example, one of his favorite things to do was to electrocute a woman to the point of near death, and then to resuscitate her using medical equipment so that she could be brought back only to be tortured again to the point of near death. So the woman was being jolted repeatedly with enormous amounts of electricity, just about passes away, and then he's using paddles and so forth to bring her back, only to do this again. And in the meantime, Cindy Hendy who incidentally was just released from prison, is sort of standing by on the side and watching all this out of a kind of a devotion to him. Fortunately, it all came to an end when he sort of stepped out of the trailer, and Cindy Hendy was alone with the last victim, Cynthia Vigil, and she stabbed Cindy Hendy with an ice pick, and was able to grab the keys, get out of a dog collar she was in, run naked out of the trailer, and run to someone who helped. And law enforcement was, they just simply had never seen anything like it. And here we are. So I mean, and you can see, listening to the story, that you're almost certainly experiencing the emotional reaction that we described, with all of the inability to fathom how somebody could do something like that and how horrible it is.
Yeah, just the revulsion and how does sex get mixed up in that?
One of the most fascinating qualities, I think, about this type of character is the mechanism, the psychological mechanism that's called splitting. So that, and Michael certainly is something of an authority on these types of personality disorders, and I think you could really speak eloquently about it. But what I'll say quickly is that what we see in these types of people are double lives, where we envision them being evil all day long, meaning that they commit evil acts all day long, acts that we would describe as evil on the scale. Because we don't really say that a person is evil; their acts are, right? But the idea would be that they don't commit evil, dusk to dawn every single day. So what happens in these people is that they can be just like David Parker Ray, good coworkers, funny, likable, have a girlfriend, have a daughter they get along with well, and so forth. And then in private have this other life. It's interesting about Ray is that he starts intermingling them, but he did have this kind of splitting with regard to women, where, for example, the woman who was working with him to torture people was put on something of a pedestal. She would be called the mistress, and he was the master. There was one incident, for example, I read about when I was reading his biography to write the vignette on him for the New Evil. It amazed me. He had a woman that he had captured, that he tortured her horribly, and then he started to sort of feel something for her, and he said to her, if I had known that you were a good woman, I would never have mistaken you for the kind of person that I would normally bring to the toy box. And, and it's, you can imagine how this woman was feeling when he said that to her.
So question on there's different types of, for especially serial killers, there's a lot of different kind of motives. One would be sadosexual, but how about like the anger retaliatory and things of that nature? Have you identified those as well?
If you look at the scale, you're touching on something very interesting. You're touching on, on the issue with the way that serial killer is presently defined. Because in the original conceptualization, and I'll tell you, I heard a story from Ann Burgess, the prominent researcher. We know her well, and as I recall the story, she told me that when that term was first created, serial killer, it had nothing to do with the idea of a serial or sequence of victims. It had to do with what used to be called years ago a serial movie or a cliffhanger or one of these kind of installment movies that you would see before the main picture when you went to the movies in the 30s or 40s. They would do a cliffhanger like Flash Gordon or Dick Tracy or something. And the villains in those serials were so stereotyped, evil all the time, wearing black, just wicked day and night, that the original idea was a serial killer was somebody that was sort of a stereotype of wanting to do evil for the sake of evil. Mm. And eventually, it just sort of worked out that serial had a double meaning, and then it sort of caught on as meaning sequence. But see, what you're touching on is this. When the concept was first created, they defined the number of people necessary to meet criteria for serial killing, but they emphasized that serial killing required that the killing was in the service of abnormal psychological gratification, which was typically psychosexual. Now, the definition simply requires that you kill two people, separated in time, remember with the cooling off period, so that, for example, if a person who's just practically motivated kills, let's say, a guy running a deli during the course of a holdup, and then 5 months later kills a banker during a holdup, that is now a serial killer. See, but this is a problem because first of all, it also has enormous effects upon the statistics that are being used to look at, all kinds of features of serial killers. But true serial killers, they really seem to fall into four subtypes. Correct me, Michael, if you don't agree on this, but it seems that the four categories are, first of all, the largest category by far would be men, and there's always men, essentially, who commit serial sexual homicide, right? So you've got this, kind of preoccupation with dominating women and sort of, reducing them to just pure objects, and there's rape and murder repeatedly, right? Sometimes torture. Mm-hmm. Then you have these people who kill people in the same way, one after the other. So, but it's really just about kind of overarching hatred, like just a kind of a misanthropic kind of a thing, right? Like sort of like Zodiac killer, right?
Hatcher in Missouri that just killed one person after another because he just had general misanthropy.
Right. Or Willie Pickett, who wasn't actually raping the prostitutes that came to the farm, he was just killing them, and wanted to kill one, a certain amount, was irritated he was one short. Then you've got, mothers who kill one child after the other. These are generally these Munchausen's by proxy kind of situations. And then you've got these angels of death, you have Donald Harvey types, who are these people who experience godlike feelings when they kill their patients or their charges or something. Those are the real four categories you generally see. And what happens is that on the scale, it seems like it's arbitrary and it's just based on how terrible they are and so forth. But if you look at the scale carefully, it's really very clear. Like, for example, category 17, there has to be 2 murders, right? So the person meets current criteria for serial killing, 2 murders separated in time, but there's a sexual element to it, and there's no torture. Clear. Mm-hmm. So then we see, for example, people that would fall into that category are a lot of garden variety sexual, men who commit serial sexual homicide where there's no torture at all. Then category 18, there can be a sexual element, but the idea is that person meets criteria for serial killing, but there's non-protracted torture, like you would see in somebody like Ted Bundy, some strangling or so forth, or Jerry Brudos, who was lifting women slowly just a little bit off the ground, by rope around the neck. But it wasn't the kind of extreme torture you see in somebody like David Porqueray. Category 19 is for people who don't kill, but who subjugate people, who do extremely sadistic things to them, like, for example, Gary Christ, who buried Barbara Jane Mackle alive underground at length. Totally unnecessary. It was just this kind of coup de grace, in addition to having, basically tried to extort money from a family. It was just out of some narcissistic need that he did it. Then category 20 is for where there's extreme torture, potentially sexual crimes, there is serial murder, but it's clearly in the context of psychosis. This is where you would place somebody like Albert Fish, someone who has a psychosis person, find particularly fascinating, because Albert Fish was clearly a psychopathic person who additionally was disinhibited by psychotic illness. Then you have category 21. This is where you have all the kind of extreme torture you would see in a category 22 killer, but there's never been murder. And this is somebody like Cameron Hooker, who kept poor Colleen Stan, living in a box 23 hours a day with an air blower, and took her out only to put her on a stretch rack or engage in sexual abuse. And then the coffin was inside the bed where he and his wife were sleeping, that kind of thing. And then, of course, we've discussed category 2. And it's quite clear, when you're dealing with true serial killers, they fall into these categories very nicely. And then there are these rare kind of serial killers that go into some earlier places on the scale, like 16, because there isn't any rape, and but there is repeat murder, and there's no torture, so a lot of them wind up in category 16.
Well, gentlemen, this has been an incredible, very interesting conversation.
Yes.
We could just go on forever, but the time won't allow it. So, but we really appreciate it, and thank you very much. I know the listeners are going to love this. And now, do you guys have a website or something that people can go to find out more information about what you guys do?
Well, I think the best thing would be to pick up The New Evil. I mean, you get pretty much anything you want to know there, and everything we've discussed would be in there. And of course, Michael's prior book, The Anatomy of Evil, is really a classic, wonderful book. But don't read it at nighttime. These are disturbing disturbing stories, and we don't hold back.
Oh, fantastic, guys. We'll have the book up on our website so people can do one click while they're listening at night and buy the book. Get the audio. It's even better.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you guys.
Yes.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or show, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.